webinar series. Today we have Sarah from the University of Utah. Sarah is a PhD student. She's working under supervision of Dr. Masood Parwania. And the title of her presentation is Data-Driven Analysis of Wildfire Post-Event Reports and um, Patterns, Causes, and Mitigation Strategies. Thank you everyone for joining this meeting, and thank you, Sarah, for doing the presentation in this event. After Sarah's presentation, we'll open the floor for question and responses. Please go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. Good morning. I'll just start with sharing my screen so I can go over my work. Thank you everyone for joining today. I hope you guys can see my screen and hear me. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Let me hide this. Okay, so today, as Fatima introduced me, I am Sarah and I work with Dr. Pravania at USAND Energy Lab. And today I will be going over my recent publication, which is Data-Driven Analysis of Wildfire Post-Event Reports. Over here, I will be mostly reviewing what I have done as a part of this work using the data from utilities for these public safety power shutoffs and how I've interpreted this. So a quick Okay. Just a quick outline of how I'm going to go over about it. So firstly, I'm going to introduce the idea of public safety power shutoffs and what are the challenges with their decision-making framework and how I interpret them using my model, using publicly available data set, and I analyze it, and then I'll just conclude with a bit of a key takeaways. So firstly, starting with the wildfire and the grid interaction. So we all know that these high impact, low probability events, such as wildfire, have become very common in these few or recent times, which impacts people's safety, prolonged grid outages, as well as, and most definitely, economic losses. So in order to lower the impact of all of these, there are three sort of mitigation strategies that mainly exist. If we are talking about preventive action, it would mostly go into a long-term system hardening related, such as undergrounding. Then we have the corrective action category, which is before or during the event. Event over here, I can say as a wildfire event, what really happens during the wildfire weather-related conditions or during a wildfire. And then we have the restorative action, what will happen once the event has passed by and how the utilities, how the things are, or the customers or the consumers or the users basically recover from this impact of wildfire. So these are the three action categories. Today, we are going to be focusing mostly on the corrective action category, where the utility is mainly left with the very limited option, mainly a power shutoff. So before I dive more into power shutoff, I really wanted to just quickly review why we are really paying attention to these public um, safety power shutoff. So we have the famous fire triangle over here, which is comprises of three main factors: weather, fuel, and ignition. So if we look into it, the weather being fire weather, which we call it, is high fire potential, low relative humidity, and high wind speeds. Combined with these live or dead plants or man-made structure, which provides us as the fuel, combined with comes with the utility power system as an ignition source, which could either be by equipment failure or it could be contact by vegetation tree strike due to high wind speed or animal or any of these things. Over historical data, we have seen that the fire ignited by power lines is obviously larger than other fires. Over here, since we will be mostly focusing in my work about California as our case study, so I have highlighted what are the most common utility sparked fires across the major utilities in California region. So this was like an overview of how the grid is interacting with the weather and the fuel and why we really want to conduct a public safety power shutoff. This leads to a overview of public safety power shutoff. So what the utilities do, considering that there is a high ignition risk, and which can really cause a fire and impact users as well as cause billions in losses, they conduct these shut-offs preemptively, and they will just to avoid the cause of ignition. However, and what so we over time we have realized that this sort of a de-energization is really unavoidable. But what real challenge becomes is how we can make these decisions more interpretable, auditable, and equitable. And that is exactly how I'm going to go overview how the utility is conducting these decisions and how we can interpret these decisions. Before I go ahead, another thing I'd like to mention is that since these decisions are so disrupting to the consumers and as well to the economy, the regulators, mainly California Public Utility Commissions, have asked these utilities to submit these post-event reports. And these post-event reports are mainly basically justifying why they did the de-energization. So how does a utility really conducts these public safety power shutoffs? What really goes into their decision making process? What goes in before the event? So now onwards, so previously the event was wildfire. Now onwards, I will be categorizing a public safety power shutoff as an event. So, sorry. So what really happens in the before phase? This I'm talking like 24 to 48 hours before the event. Public safety power shutoff event is supposed to take place. So the step one is what utilities usually does is they basically look at these weather related parameters forecast and they start to activate them based on some threshold they have. For instance, if wind exceeds certain speed, they activate the threshold potential for this. Once this is done, they start to go into in-depth review where they basically go more into wildfire risk modeling and categorize what is the risk of a fire actually starting if anything comes in contact with the utility equipment. So this is step two. And then step three is basically determining the outage area based on all these focus parameters and risk factors. They determine, oh, this is going to be the scope of the fire. And this scope is translated into during the event phase where a PSPS event is either activated. For instance, you will receive a notification that you're going to lose your power, or for instance, it is canceled and you receive a notification that the event's going to be canceled. And how during that phase, mainly what is being done is that they're balancing the wildfire risk against the PSPS consequence. And once the event passes by, for instance, they shut off your electricity or they did not shut off. They decided not to shut it off and notify you that we're not doing it. And sometimes they won't even notify you. So after now we are moving from a during phase into the after phase. During the after phase, what happens? They'll inspect, they'll say, okay, it's safe to restore the power. They'll safely restore the power, and they will record these post-event reports as asked by the regulators to report them, to report on the factors, whatever happened for in the before phase. What factors went into their decision making, why, what were their model inputs and outputs, and what customers were impacted. It's like an extreme detailed event reporting that's happening. And that is exactly where I come in. I will be taking these post-event reports to infer on what decision utility took and why it took, and what factors went into their decision making. So moving on, PSPS is most definitely a very challenging decision-making process. It is a balance between wildfire prevention, as I showed you during the phase, versus an outage impact. Outage impact could be economic losses. It could be how the critical facilities are impacted by it. Then comes that there's a lot of uncertainty over here because as I started out to say that the utility is mostly forecasting these parameters and seeing what factors will activate can potentially lead to a wildfire. And in favor of that, they chose to preemptively shut you down. So this is a lot of uncertainty is there within their models. And also along with all of this, there's a lot operational coordination that works across the teams, just not the utility, but all the other emergency or critical facilities. So there's a lot of coordination, real-time complications. Everything is like very complicated. It's a mix, and that's why these decisions are at times very aggressive or not aggressive. So this is the part where we are like, okay, so this is a difficult decision-making process. But we need to realize that PSPS is most definitely critical as it is the last resort for high impact, low probability warfare events. And it is most definitely important to reduce ignition risk while all the other mitigations have fall short. So this is like in time sort of a action, like an ad hoc based sort of a decision making that needs to be done. And at the same time comes the role of post event reports because it has captured all of these lessons or all of these decisions, these thresholds, and in order to ensure this transparency and accountability. So PSPS is most definitely a challenging process, and it is a very critical mitigation in presence of a fire weather event as well. And then we have the post-event report, uh, where we can learn lessons and thresholds to ensure transparency. So this is what I'm doing now. I'll go into how what I have done with this, all of this data from the post-event wildfire. So the first step that I did was to take all of these post-event wildfire reports into structured inputs. I had two, so I did a case study on California utilities, mainly PG&E and SDG&E event reports. I took those reports and I labeled them as executed. So executed over here will be an event, a PSPS event, which took place. And a canceled event was where you were as a customer notified, but the event was not executed. They activated all the potentials, they informed all the emergency services, but they never really took the they never really conducted the PSPS. So after encoding this, I came up with a couple of data set challenges that I had with all the data set that I had coming from these post-event reports. One of the few ones was that only after around 2020, the utility started to record these events, and it was a very scattered data with a high class imbalance. So we have limited sample size, we have a severe class imbalance, and also on top of all of this is that PG&E is one of the utilities, is using apparently 17 variables to activate a fire potential or activate a PSPS event. At the same time, SDGNE is using way less or fewer parameters. So there's a little bit of complexity or inconsistency across the utilities, even though they lie among the same geographic region. So this motivated me further to go into a bit of a more data-driven method so I can see that how we can interpret the decisions. So I did a bit of a feature engineering and pre-processing here. Most importantly, as I mentioned, that PG&E had like 17 factors. So I realized when I was doing a correlation sort of a heat map that there are a lot of redundant features, which basically are adding not much to the eventual model that I'm aiming for. So I started to see that if I drop these parameters, for instance, what will be the impact? Mostly the factors that I ended up dropping were humidity over different hours or fuel moisture over different hours, because they really were not impacting the decision making at the end that much. After cleaning up the data, scaling and normalization, I split the data into two data sets. One thing I would mention again is that I had said that I had used two utilities as my case study, PG&E and SDG&E. But another thing that I came across was that PG&E's data was where PG&E had canceled event as well as executed events. SDG&E was only limited to recording positive class because, as I said, a lot of scattered data across the utilities. So I ended up using PG&E's data for main model training and later a main model training, which I'm calling a vanilla SVM. So now the data engineering is completed. I have a vanilla SVM model where I have trained a decision boundary, which really tells me where the utility is basically taking a decision to either shut off or not to shut off, or like to cancel an event or to execute an event. I took this decision boundaries, converted into a probabilistic scaling, so it could be interpreted aside from -1 and a 1. I did a confidence calibration. But as you remember, I just mentioned that SDG&E had only positive class. And that is the case for other utilities across California, or if I'm even talking or extending to WEG corridor, that there's a scatter of data with variable factors that went into their decision making. So what I did, I was like, how about I take this SDG&E data and do a little bit of a importance weighted rescaling and see where the difference really lies between these two utilities, and if I can come up with a model which can be generalized across utilities. So I took the SVM model, learned on PG&E as my target variable, and I did a little bit of reviewing my model so it can adjust to my SDG&E. Over here, as you can see, that these are the few of the overlap of, or only factors that were common across both the utilities uh, in measurement ways and how they really were interpreting them for their decision boundaries. PG&E was using only these SDG&E was only using these 5 factors for activating a PSPS event, whereas at the same time, PG&E was using 17 factors, which I had already narrowed down to less factors. So yeah, so I realized that when I did this reviewing, my model did lose a little bit of accuracy, but it did got a better recall. So my model, whereas it was not so 100% accurate as it was before, if I was testing it on SDG and etc., it got a better recall. So it could adapt, or it could like, the model that I eventually come up with is a model that could adopt across the utilities or journalize, even if we are giving it in a generic sort of input features rather than specific to PG&E or to SDG&E or any of the other utilities. So I came up with this generic model, and just to evaluate it further, I went into 2 things. I will now go into discussing about the evaluation factors. So one of the few things is, firstly I did was to basically validate or what decisions I make and why I made those decisions. So the first one was feature space ablation. Over here, I played around with the idea of what will really happen if I started to drop some features and see how the accuracy really impacted of my SVM decision boundary. I realized that whereas a lot of factors, when I'm taking all 17 factors, the accuracy is around 92%. But when I'm when I'm dropping all of my fuel moisture related features, I had the most impact on my um, um, accuracy output. So I realized that fuel mainly impacts the most or impacts the most decision making when it comes to utilities perspective or their decision making models. Um, this was the first thing that I observed, is that fuel moisture is most definitely the most important factor when it comes to such decisions. Another thing that I did was to say, oh, why SVM? Why not any other classifiers that we have? I did a bit of a um, score comparison across these, whereas I would say that, yeah, sure, other classifiers are performing a little better than my SVM, but what really are focused over here is that we are trying to learn a decision boundary where the decisions are very much blindly classified. So it's easier, or it's better, or it's most appropriate to stick to a model such as SVM, and that's exactly what I did. Moving on, I went into doing another small thing, is that I was like, okay, now I had these set of features. What really happens if I start to drop these extreme features? I set up a threshold of dropping like 75% of the data, or like my upper quartile and my lower quartile of data, and see what really happens to my SVM and how really of a good of a model my SVM is. Over here, I observed, if I do exclude some of the extreme data set values, this is my accuracy for sure decrease, but my recall remained high. So across the time when I had reweighted my SVM, I had dropped some redundant features, and I have learned a decision boundary using utility. I've come up with a model which has a high recall and which is generalizable and which could be translated across utility. So this was a model that I have come up with, and this is like, okay, this is my final model. So what I go ahead into is another sort of evaluating. So initially, I had mentioned something like how we have some wildfire risk when it comes. Like utility is also in step two. So step one mainly was forecast-based parameters, but step two was when it was weighing in all these risk consequence scores of their own models to say that, okay, if a wildfire starts, that's how it's going to grow. So I took these risk scores across the data sets, and I did a little bit of a pre-processing and used a k-mean algorithm to form these risk-based clusters, and on these clusters apply my learned SVM model and come up with decision clusters and interpretate these results. So this was what I really came across. These were like the four zones I came across. So, firstly, was the ambiguous decision making, where the utility sometimes had decided to turn off these distribution circuits and sometimes it not have. So, this is where I come in and give a mitigation strategy. I say that these sort of circuits where this sort of decision making is very common could benefit from using sectionalizing or targeted automation, like sectionalizing devices and reducing the impact on customers, where these you install these devices into the field so the customers who are turned off can be reduced. Then we came up with a high risk area where for sure there was a lot of over the historical data a lot of shut off decisions being made. So my mitigation strategy for these circuits or these repetitive circuits over time is just to prioritize microgrid, because you know that over the time over the years and over the time regular PSPS events have are being conducted over here. So why not have these microgrids set up over there so that they can improve the resilience of that area in such weather conditions. Then I came to the high risk, which were the edge cases, which were very few, but they were like very high risk and where the utility has decided to take a PSPS decision, irrespective of irrespective even if the some of the thresholds were not activated because they really did not want to risk over here. So for these regions, we can deploy advanced protection and enhanced vegetation management. This goes into planning, kind of a planning strategy, which is we are doing it way ahead when we are analyzing these data. And finally, we come to utility-driven risk, which could basically be much more like benchmarking circuits or benchmarking data sets we can use. So this was sort of a evaluation we did. So the key takeaways that I do is, since I have been talking patterns, causes, and mitigation, so I conclude in those ways. So the patterns basically made us observe that if utilities translate basically these weather forecasts into PSS decision making, and I was able to distinguish four behavioral zones and observe what really went into those zones and what could really be done to improve those zones. Then we come into causes, where we were able to see what really strongly dictated PSPS activations by the utility and how we can calibrate the models to adapt to journalize across the utilities area. And then finally, a mitigation. My main goal has been to offer a tool which could really be give an operational point of view, transparency and accountability for what the utility did and why it did. This was a goal when I started to look into actual utilities reports, and that I kind of did with my study. So yes, thank you very much. And I'm open for question and answers, and you can scan this to read more about my work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your great presentation. It was very informative.